My father refused to pay for my education, then used my name for a fraudulent loan. Now, I'm being sued. When I was 25 years old, I found myself sitting in a cramped office with flickering fluorescent lights, listening to a lawyer tell me that I was about to be sued for defaulting on a massive loan. I remember gripping the edges of my chair so hard my knuckles turned white, trying to steady the swirl of panic in my chest. I'd been careful with my finances ever since high school, making sure to keep my credit cards paid off and my student loans, the few I had managed to qualify for, up to date. Yet there I was, facing a lawsuit for a debt so large it made my head spin. And the worst part was I hadn't even known this loan existed. As the lawyer's words sank in, one horrifying truth emerged. My father, Bill, a 54-year-old man I had grown up fearing more than loving, had used my name to take out a fraudulent loan. Now it was past due, and the creditors had come knocking for me. My name is Emily Carter, a 25-year-old woman from a small town in central Illinois. I grew up on the outskirts of Greenwood, a place you'd likely miss if you blinked while driving down the old highway. Greenwood had one grocery store, one gas station, a single-screen movie theater, and a feed store that doubled as a hardware shop. The community was tight-knit in the way small rural towns often are. Secrets whispered behind neighbors' backs but rarely spoken aloud, gossip traded at Sunday service or at the register of the local diner. My father, Bill Carter, was a notorious figure in town, though not for the reasons you might expect of a notorious man. He wasn't a hardened criminal or a local celebrity. He was, in many ways, just a loud and stubborn presence who seemed to feed off disapproval. He argued with anyone who didn't see the world as he did. He had a short fuse, especially after he'd had a few beers, and he never hesitated to scold or belittle anyone, especially me. Bill was tall, with a wiry frame that never seemed to fill out, no matter how much he ate or drank. He had thinning brown hair, often hidden under a stained baseball cap, and a perpetual scowl etched into his features. Once in a while, I remembered him smiling when I was very young, maybe around 4 or 5 years old, throwing me up in the air and catching me, telling me I was his little princess. But that memory was fuzzy, blurred by all the times I saw him angry instead. My mother, Susan, left him when I was 12. She was tired of the fights, the broken promises, and the stress of living paycheck to paycheck while Dad refused to change jobs or ambitions. After the divorce, she moved a few towns over to live with her sister, Aunt Lola. She invited me to come live with her too, but Bill threatened all sorts of legal action, determined to keep me under his roof. "I'm the parent," he'd say, "and what I say goes." At the time, I was caught between them. Mom was my source of comfort, laughter, and those gentle bedtime stories I loved as a kid, but she was also the one who left. Dad might have been angry and overbearing, but he stayed, which to my 12-year-old mind seemed like evidence that he cared. I also naively thought he might soften up if it were just the two of us. Instead, he sank deeper into bitterness, constantly ranting about my mother's betrayal and how he'd never trust a woman again. I became his stand-in for everything he disliked about the world, a captive audience for his frustrations. He was especially controlling when it came to money. He lectured me on frugality, telling me that money doesn't grow on trees. Yet he spent plenty on cheap beer and gambling at the local pool hall on weekends. He insisted I get a job the moment I turned 16. I worked part-time at the diner, scrubbing dishes and mopping floors after closing, just to have a little cash of my own. Dad took his share of my earnings each week for rent, even though I was still a minor. Whenever I asked him why I had to pay to live in my own house, he'd get this piercing look in his eyes and say, "You want to eat, don't you? You want a roof over your head? This is the real world, Emily. You earn your keep." I didn't argue, because I'd learned that arguing only ended in doors slammed so hard the house shook and more threats about sending me away to live with relatives I barely knew. By the time I was 17, I had managed to squirrel away enough money for a local community college application fee. It wasn't much, but I had hopes of studying nursing or perhaps business, anything that would get me out of Greenwood. My father's stance on college was unyielding. I ain't paying a dime for that nonsense. In his mind, higher education was a scam designed to turn people into snobs who looked down on rural folk. If you want to spend your time in fancy classrooms, you'd better figure out how to pay for it, he'd bark whenever I brought it up. So I applied for scholarships, filled out FAFSA forms, and took the ACT twice to improve my score. My mother tried to send small checks now and then, but her finances were tight too. She worked as a receptionist at a dental clinic, barely making enough to cover her rent and bills. I graduated high school a semester early, desperate to get a jump on something, anything that might offer me a future beyond Greenwood. I was 19 by the time I enrolled in the local community college. It wasn't a big, prestigious university, but it was mine. My dreams at that point were simple: get a 2-year degree, transfer to a bigger school, and eventually become independent enough to never have to rely on my father again. That's when Bill delivered a crushing blow. He marched into my room one afternoon while I was studying for midterms. I'll never forget the way he stood in the doorway, arms crossed, glaring at the stack of books on my desk. "Your tuition's due again," he said. "Don't look at me. You know I'm not paying." "Dad, I wasn't going to ask you," I started to say, but he cut me off. "Then you better figure out how to keep going, or you'll be flipping burgers for the rest of your life," he said, then stormed out. I remember biting back tears. It wasn't so much that I expected him to help. I'd known for years that was never going to happen. It was the cruelty of his tone, the way he seemed to relish watching me scramble. Part of me wanted to snap back that flipping burgers would at least be my own money, my own life, but I knew the argument would go nowhere. So I kept my head down, worked extra shifts at the diner, took out a small student loan I qualified for, and cobbled together enough to stay enrolled. My life turned into a cycle of sleepless nights, homework, and prayers that a better future was on the horizon. After a year at community college, I managed to transfer to a slightly larger state college in Springfield, still an hour away from Greenwood. I was 20 by then, a sophomore who couldn't afford on-campus housing. I lived in a rundown apartment with 2 roommates, shared the rent, and budgeted groceries to the last penny. Sometimes I'd get texts from Dad telling me I was wasting my time. He'd write things like, "I see the bills piling up, don't come crying to me," or "I'm not bailing you out if your tuition check bounces." I hated that those words still had the power to cut me deep. It wasn't just the lack of financial support. It was the contempt. The sense that he wanted me to fail so I'd have to admit he was right all along. I stuck it out. I juggled classes and part-time work, sometimes living off ramen for weeks on end. The stress was constant, but also fueled by a stubborn determination to prove him wrong, to show him I could make it without his help. By the time I was 21, I graduated with an associate's degree in business administration. Nothing fancy, but it opened some doors. I landed a job at a local insurance company, not as an agent, but doing office work, filing, scheduling appointments, handling data entry. It wasn't my dream job, but it was a foot in the door, and it paid better than the diner. That's when I learned an important lesson about adulthood. Just because you move on to a new phase of life doesn't mean your old problems magically vanish. My father still hovered on the outskirts of everything I did, like a dark cloud threatening to storm. He'd call me up randomly, drunk, and rant about how college is a sham, or how women these days are ungrateful. I tried to keep these conversations short. Eventually, I started letting them go to voicemail, ignoring his texts. I spent Christmas and Thanksgiving with Mom and Aunt Lola rather than go back to the farmhouse. Dad didn't seem to care. He just sent me a text once that read, "Fine, do what you want, don't come crawling back." At 22, I started paying off my small student loans. I stayed in Springfield, having sworn I'd never live under Dad's roof again. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. I rented a tiny studio apartment on the edge of town, shared walls with neighbors who played loud music, and made do with battered secondhand furniture. At least it was mine, right? At least I could say no one was going to barge in and yell at me for existing. I worked diligently at the insurance office, took on extra hours to earn a bit more, and tried to keep my finances in good shape. I was proud of that, even if my father would never acknowledge it. Then last year, just after I'd turned 24, a letter arrived at my apartment. It was from a loan servicing company in Chicago, referencing an unpaid balance of nearly $40,000. My first reaction was confusion. Surely it had to be a mistake. My legitimate student loan had been smaller and was already being repaid on schedule. This new letter looked vaguely official, but also suspicious. I called the company's toll-free number, expecting to straighten out a clerical error. Instead, I was told that Emily Carter had co-signed a personal loan over a year ago, and it had gone into default months prior. The interest had accrued so heavily that the balance was now enormous. I was stunned. I'd never co-signed anything for anyone, let alone a huge personal loan. The representative on the phone said something like, "Maybe a relative took out the loan in your name. That happens sometimes." My stomach dropped. I felt cold sweat beading on my forehead. Could my father have done this? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. He had all my personal information from when I was younger, including my social security number. He'd never asked me for help with a loan, and even if he had, I would have said no. But that wouldn't have stopped him from forging my signature. Suddenly, memories swarmed me. Times when I was younger and he made me sign blank checks just in case, or times he rummaged through my mail without asking. I drove back to Greenwood that same weekend, dreading the confrontation. The entire hour-long trip, my heart thumped so loud I could barely focus. When I pulled up to the farmhouse, it looked even more run down than I remembered. The paint on the porch was peeling, and a broken-down truck was rusting in the driveway. My father came out wearing his usual baseball cap and a sour expression. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked defensive, like he'd been expecting this day to come. "Dad," I said, stepping out of my car, clutching the letter in my hand, "we need to talk." He narrowed his eyes and crossed his arms. "About what?" "This," I said, waving the letter. "A loan. $40,000 taken out in my name." His gaze shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing his face, but he quickly replaced it with anger. "Don't you come blaming me for your money problems," he barked. I stood my ground. "I never took out this loan. Someone forged my signature." "Well, it wasn't me," he said, looking away, but the way he spoke told me everything I needed to know. I felt tears burning in my eyes. "Why would you do this? How could you do this to me?" He spat on the ground. "Times have been hard. The farm's not making ends meet. I figured once I got back on my feet, I'd pay it off before you ever noticed." I wanted to scream, to hurl the letter at him, to call him every name under the sun. Instead, I found myself shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Dad, this is illegal. They're coming after me. My credit's on the line, my future." He shrugged, defiant. "I said I'd pay it off. Just need more time. Don't act like some saint, Emily. You think you're better than me just because you went off to college." That stung, but it also fueled my resolve. I realized that trying to reason with him was pointless. He didn't see the gravity of what he'd done. All he saw was a means to an end, a way to get money he thought he deserved. The next day, I visited a lawyer in Springfield, my first real experience with any sort of legal counsel. I was shaking so badly, I almost dropped the stack of papers I brought. I remember the lawyer's name was Sam Fowler, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, probably in his late 40s. He had kind eyes, which helped put me at ease. I showed him the letter, explained the situation, and braced myself for his reaction. Sam listened quietly, took notes, and then said, "Fraud and identity theft cases involving family members can be very complicated. You may need to press charges against your father if you want to fully clear your name." My stomach twisted into knots. Press charges against my own father? The man I'd grown up with, no matter how flawed he was? Another wave of anger washed over me, remembering how he used to snatch part of my paycheck for rent, how he refused to support my education, how he undermined every dream I ever had. Yet the idea of taking him to court was terrifying. Sam explained that if I didn't challenge the authenticity of my signature and prove it was forged, the loan company would continue to hold me liable for the debt. They might file a lawsuit to recover it. In fact, they already had enough grounds to initiate legal proceedings, which meant I'd have to defend myself. I called Dad again, trying to reason with him. "They're saying I need to file a police report for identity theft," I told him over the phone. "If you cooperate, maybe we can fix this without you going to jail, but I need you to come clean." He scoffed. "I'm not admitting to anything. This is your mess. Don't try to pin it on me." And then he hung up. My hands were shaking as I put the phone down. I realized with painful clarity that he wasn't going to help me. He would let me go under if it meant avoiding personal consequences. For the next few weeks, I tried everything. Calling the loan company, sending them documentation that I never authorized any such transaction, offering to take a handwriting test to prove the signature wasn't mine. But they told me it was out of their hands, that if I believed the signature was forged, I had to involve law enforcement. They had a valid contract on file showing Emily Carter as a cosigner, along with a copy of my driver's license, which had apparently been scanned or copied when I was still living at Dad's house. I felt violated in a way I'd never experienced before, like someone had broken into the deepest part of my life and stolen my identity. Finally, I made the gut-wrenching decision. I filed a police report and gave them my father's information. I hated myself for doing it, but Sam Fowler explained that if I didn't, there would be no official record of fraud or identity theft, and the loan company would continue to hold me responsible. The local police took my statement, but they didn't rush to arrest my father. In a small town, the wheels of justice move slowly, especially when the suspect is someone they've known all their lives. Meanwhile, the loan company's lawyers did exactly what Sam predicted. They filed a civil suit against me, claiming breach of contract. That's how I ended up in that cramped office, listening to Sam explain the next steps while I tried to keep from hyperventilating. When the suit was officially served, I called Dad in a panic. This time he actually answered. "They're suing me, Dad," I said, voice shaking. "You have to tell them you forged my signature. You have to fix this." "Don't call me again," he growled and hung up. That was it. I sat in my tiny apartment afterward, tears streaming down my face, remembering the times I'd scraped together money for rent while still handing him half my paycheck when I was a teenager. All I'd ever wanted was to break free from his grip. Now it felt like he'd found a way to drag me back. Days turned into weeks. Mom found out what was happening, and she was furious at Dad. "Emily, I'm so sorry," she said over the phone. She was 50 years old now, living with Aunt Lola still, taking care of Lola's kids when she could. "Your father always had a mean streak, but I never thought he'd stoop to this. Let me know if there's anything I can do." I asked if she might be willing to testify about Dad's history of taking my personal information without permission. She agreed right away, though I worried how that might go over in court. Meanwhile, Sam Fowler, my lawyer, filed a response to the suit, stating that the loan was fraudulent and that I denied ever co-signing it. The judge scheduled a hearing, and I felt like my life was unraveling. I kept going to work at the insurance office where my boss politely pretended not to notice how often I had to slip away to answer calls from Sam or step outside to calm my racing heart. Eventually, the police did question my father, but apparently he told them I'd willingly co-signed the loan and was now trying to back out. He lied without flinching, sticking to his story that I'd simply changed my mind because I didn't want to pay. That complicated the police investigation since it became a matter of he said, she said, although the forged signature was so clumsy it looked nothing like my real one. Even so, it would take a handwriting expert or some kind of deeper investigation to prove it conclusively in a criminal court. As the months dragged on, the civil lawsuit advanced. The loan company's attorneys started sending me discovery requests. They wanted copies of emails, text messages, anything that might indicate I'd known about the loan. It was nerve-wracking. Sam reassured me that the burden was on them to prove I'd signed willingly, but that didn't stop them from digging. I compiled everything I could, even found old text messages where Dad had bragged, "It's not like you owe them anything if you never see the bills." That sounded vaguely incriminating, but we weren't sure if it would hold up in court. The hearing date loomed like a dark cloud. I was so anxious that I could hardly sleep. Night after night, I lay awake in my small bedroom, replaying worst-case scenarios. Losing the case, having my wages garnished for decades, or even worse, being labeled a willing participant in fraud. I had nightmares about bailiffs escorting me out of a courtroom in handcuffs while my father stood by, smirking. Occasionally, I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to a silent phone, half expecting Dad to call and say it was all a misunderstanding, that he'd straighten it out. But that call never came. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Sam and I showed up to the courthouse early. I wore a conservative black skirt and blazer, trying to project an image of seriousness and honesty. My stomach twisted in knots as we walked through the metal detectors. Everything felt too bright, too sterile, like reality had sharpened around me. I spotted my father in the hallway, looking disheveled in an ill-fitting suit. He avoided my eyes, feigning interest in a vending machine as we passed. My chest tightened with conflicting emotions: fury, betrayal, a sliver of pity. Despite everything he'd done, he was still my dad. But I couldn't let that stop me from clearing my name. In the small courtroom, we took our seats. A judge in a dark robe entered, and I felt like I was watching my life unfold from behind glass. The loan company's attorney presented their case, showing the loan documents with my forged signature. Then Sam spoke on my behalf, explaining that the signature was not mine, that I never consented, and that we believed Bill Carter had committed the fraud. We also submitted the text messages I had, along with an affidavit from my mother, stating that my father had a long history of controlling behavior and financial manipulation. My father, when called to the stand, insisted that I had helped him voluntarily. He even tried to paint me as an ungrateful daughter who was just trying to dodge responsibility. Listening to him lie so brazenly under oath was almost too much to bear. I swallowed the urge to scream that he was lying, that I'd never even known about the loan until the letters started coming. Sam cross-examined him, asking about specifics, like the date and time I supposedly signed the papers. Dad stumbled over his words, gave conflicting answers. The judge didn't seem impressed by Dad's performance, but I knew it wasn't a slam dunk just yet. That's when Sam presented a copy of my real signature from my driver's license, side by side with the loan documents. The differences were glaring. My father shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Then Sam asked if the loan officer was present or if we had any witness from the loan company who had actually handled the paperwork. Turns out that loan officer was no longer with the bank, but we had a record of who notarized it. The notary was a friend of Dad's, a local guy named Gary Burns, who'd lost his notary license the previous year for misconduct. It was all starting to look like a staged scheme. The judge concluded the hearing with a promise to review everything and issue a ruling within a few weeks. As we filed out of the courtroom, my father turned to me with a sneer. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" he said under his breath. Before I could respond, Sam put a hand on my shoulder and guided me away. I sat in Sam's car, trembling from the adrenaline rush, not sure whether to cry, scream, or faint. Sam reassured me that we'd presented a strong case, but warned that judges can sometimes issue unexpected rulings. Those next few weeks were excruciating. I tried to stay busy at work, but my mind kept wandering. I'd stare at spreadsheets, only to realize 20 minutes had passed and I'd entered the same data incorrectly 3 times. At night, I told my boyfriend, Jacob, who was 26, soft-spoken, and working as a paramedic, about my worries. He tried to be supportive, offering me a shoulder to cry on and telling me that justice would prevail. Yet I couldn't shake the fear that maybe I'd end up responsible for a loan I never asked for, courtesy of a father I couldn't trust. When the ruling finally came, it was like a carefully wrapped package of relief and heartbreak. The judge found in my favor, stating that the evidence strongly suggested the signature was forged. He voided my liability for the loan. I sat in the courtroom, tears in my eyes, hardly able to believe that I was free, at least from the civil side of things. Dad stormed out before I could see his reaction. I don't know if he was served any documents that day, or if the loan company filed charges against him afterward. Sam told me they had every right to recoup their losses from the actual perpetrator, but that was no longer my battle. You'd think I'd be ecstatic, dancing in the streets the moment I left the courthouse. Instead, I felt numb. My father had tried to ruin me financially, and now I had the weight of knowing I'd effectively thrown him to the wolves, even though it was his own wrongdoing. Mom called me that evening, relieved at the ruling and at the same time sad that things had come to such a final break in my relationship with Dad. "Maybe this will be a wake-up call for him," she said quietly, though she didn't sound convinced. Part of me wished for some cinematic moment where Dad, cornered, would finally break down and say he was sorry, that he'd been desperate, that he loved me and regretted what he'd done. But that moment never came. In the following months, I heard rumors from Greenwood neighbors that Dad was in trouble with the law, that he might lose the farm. I tried not to indulge in gossip, but a certain twisted sense of schadenfreude welled up in me when I pictured him facing the consequences of his own lies. Then I'd feel guilty, remembering that he was still my father and wishing life hadn't forced us into adversaries. At age 25, I found myself moving forward with my own life, cautiously, somewhat jaded by the betrayal, but also proud that I'd stood up for myself. My credit was battered by the ordeal, but at least it wasn't completely destroyed. Sam helped me draft letters to credit bureaus explaining the fraud, and I slowly began rebuilding my financial credibility. My insurance office job evolved, and I got a promotion into a slightly better position managing small commercial policies. Jacob and I moved in together, sharing a modest one-bedroom apartment. We adopted a rescue dog named Luna, a sweet, goofy German Shepherd mix who became my emotional anchor on stressful days. I never saw Dad again, not after that hearing. Every once in a while, I'd get a pang of sadness, thinking about the man who was supposed to be a parent, supposed to guide and protect me. Instead, he shoved me into the deep end, hoping I'd either learn to swim or drown so he could benefit. Still, I guess in a backhanded way, he did teach me something: resilience. He taught me to stand on my own 2 feet, to never rely on someone else's good graces when they've shown you who they are time and time again. I discovered more about the power of forgiveness, too, or the complexity of it at least. People sometimes say, forgive and forget. But forgetting doesn't come naturally when you've been hurt this deeply. Forgiveness, if it ever truly happens, is a process. For me, it looked like letting go of the fantasies that Dad would ever change or apologize. It looked like building a life in which he wasn't a central figure, releasing the anger piece by piece, and focusing on the things I could control: my job, my relationships with the people I loved, and my own mental well-being. A few months after the ruling, I received a letter in the mail from Bill Carter. I recognized the messy handwriting on the envelope right away. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter was short and vague. He mostly ranted about how the farm might be taken away, how nobody in town was on his side anymore, how I'd humiliated him in front of everyone, and how I was just like my mother. There was no apology, no acceptance of guilt. He even threatened to sue me for defamation if I kept slandering him, which was ironic, considering he was the one who forged my signature. I read it, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions, then shredded it and threw it in the trash. That was the end of our communication. I turned 26 not long after. Jacob and I celebrated with a quiet dinner, a few friends, and a homemade chocolate cake. I remember laughing that night, looking around the table at people who genuinely cared about me. My best friend, Alicia, a spunky 25-year-old who'd known me since high school, her boyfriend, Marcus, and even my cousin, Dylan, who drove in from another town. The reflection in their eyes was warmth and acceptance, not the cold, judgmental glare my father always gave me. I thought about how I'd come full circle, from a naive teenager scrubbing dishes at a diner to a working professional, from a terrified girl in a lawyer's office to someone who'd faced a lawsuit and come out the other side. My father's sabotage didn't break me. If anything, it forced me to become stronger, more aware of my own boundaries and worth. People in Greenwood likely still whisper about what happened. Small towns never really let go of juicy stories. Maybe they say, "Did you hear Bill Carter used his own daughter's name for a loan?" Or that Emily Carter took her old man to court. If that's the talk of the town, so be it. I haven't been back since the hearing, and I don't plan to visit anytime soon. Mom occasionally drives through Greenwood on her way to see Aunt Lola, and she updates me vaguely. "Your dad's farm is up for sale," or "I saw him at the gas station, looking thin and older." I never ask her to elaborate. Some part of me wants to remain ignorant, to avoid scraping open old wounds. Legally, I'm safe now, free from that fraudulent debt. But sometimes I still lie awake at night and think about the intangible cost of everything that happened. The fear, the anger, the sense of betrayal, it all leaves scars. Yet I also think about how I found a sense of self-worth in the midst of chaos. I proved to myself that I'm capable of standing up for what's right, even if it means taking on the very person who was supposed to protect me from such harm. Jacob once asked me, "Do you ever think you'll speak to your dad again?" I paused for a long time before answering. "I don't know," I said honestly. Maybe if he ever truly admitted what he did, maybe if he tried to make amends somehow, but I'm not holding my breath. The truth is, people rarely change unless they truly want to, and Dad never wanted to. He lived by a code of pride and defiance, even if it meant burning every bridge around him. There are days when I wonder if that pride hides a deep well of insecurity. Maybe he never felt good enough, so he tore other people down. Maybe losing the farm or facing his own mortality will eventually crack the armor he's worn all these years. If that ever happens and he reaches out, I might be open to listening, but I'll never forget, and I won't allow him to sabotage me again. That's the fine line I walk between pity, sorrow, and self-preservation. In the meantime, I live my life with a sense of cautious optimism. I'm finishing some night courses to further my business administration credentials with an eye toward a management role at the insurance firm, or maybe even starting my own small consultancy one day. My credit score, although bruised, is slowly recovering with every on-time payment I make for my legitimate bills. Jacob and I talk about the future, about marriage, kids, a house with a fenced yard where Luna can run around. These are dreams I'm piecing together one day at a time, small victories that remind me I'm not defined by my father's mistakes. Sometimes I'll get a flashback to sitting in that lawyer's office, hearing the words, "You're being sued for a loan in your name." The memory still makes my heart lurch. It's like a shadow that follows me, a reminder of how quickly life can unravel when you trust the wrong person or when someone with access to your details decides to misuse them. But it also reminds me that I'm stronger than I thought. For the longest time, I lived under my father's shadow, powerless. Now I'm the one casting my own light, stepping out from his toxic control. I still wonder what will become of my father, Bill Carter, the man who once bragged to everyone in Greenwood that he was the toughest, most self-reliant farmer in the county. The man who refused to pay for my education, then turned around and used me as collateral for his own failing finances. Perhaps he'll drift through life, blaming everyone but himself. Perhaps he'll lose the farm and end up alone, nursing his resentments in a rundown trailer. Or maybe, just maybe, he'll have a moment of clarity someday. But if that moment arrives, I hope he realizes that real strength isn't about taking advantage of others or mocking their dreams. It's about helping each other rise, about knowing when to admit wrongdoing and seek forgiveness. The lawsuit closed a chapter in my life, but the emotional aftermath is ongoing. I learned that family can be the people who love you, support you, and hold your hand when you're trembling with fear, regardless of whether they share your bloodline. I also learned that sometimes the ones who share your blood can be the quickest to hurt you, especially if they're blinded by pride or desperation. None of that changes the fact that you have to protect yourself legally and emotionally from those who would drag you down. So here I am, 25 years old, writing out my story. Sometimes it feels like I'm still that 16-year-old girl handing over half her paycheck to Dad, so I have the privilege of living under his roof. Other times I feel like a brand new person, forging a path free from his abuses. Both identities exist in me, and maybe they always will. Life isn't neat. It doesn't tie up in a perfect bow just because a judge rules in your favor. But I like to believe that each day I choose to be honest, to be kind, and to stand up for myself is a day I move further away from the legacy of bitterness my father tried to impose on me. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the best revenge isn't seeing him punished or begging for mercy. It's living well, building a life on my own terms, and never again letting someone else's selfishness define who I am or what I can achieve. If one day I have a child of my own, I'll show them what real parental love looks like. Unconditional support, respect, and a willingness to help them chase their dreams rather than sabotage them out of jealousy or greed. I've often replayed the moment in my head when I confronted Dad on the porch of the farmhouse. That first time I realized he'd stolen my identity. There's a part of me that wishes I'd looked him straight in the eye and said, "You can't break me. but I suppose my actions said it for me. I fought back, I cleared my name, and I'm still here, forging ahead. That's the truth of who I am, despite the father who refused to see my worth, even as he exploited my name. Life goes on. I pay my bills, clean my little apartment, take Luna for long walks, plan dinners with Jacob. Some evenings after the sun sets, I'll stand on my balcony and watch the lights of Springfield stretch out before me. I'll think about Greenwood, that tiny town with a single grocery store and a feed shop, and realize how far I've come. Maybe it's not measured in miles, but in growth. I'm not that scared kid anymore. I've found my voice, my strength, and my resolve to protect my future from anyone who tries to hijack it, even if that person shares my DNA. That is my story. The day I discovered my own father took a fraudulent loan in my name, the day I was dragged into a lawsuit, and the day I finally took a stand. It's not a happy tale, but it's mine. If there's one thing I hope someone reading this takes away, it's that you can break cycles of abuse and betrayal. You can be the one who says enough and demands better, even when it means taking on people who should have been in your corner all along. It won't be easy, and it won't be painless, but the moment you choose your own dignity over someone else's deceit can be the start of a life you truly own. And so at 25, I carry on. I've learned that family can betray you, but also that you can survive it and rebuild. My father refused to pay for my education. Then he used my name for a fraudulent loan, leaving me to pick up the pieces. I was terrified when I realized I was being sued, but I fought back. I faced him in court and walked away with my life and my future still intact. Every day, I remind myself that his failure to love me the way a parent should is not my failure. It's his. And I refuse to let it define me any longer. Now I define myself, resilient, determined, and free.